everybody. My name is Haas Distinguished Visitor, here with David, Beaulieu, and Ty Anthony. We're going to do an opening song just to welcome everybody. We're going to be doing the AIM theme song, the American Indian Movement theme song, which is supposed to bring everybody together, all the indigenous people from the North America, from the tips of Chile to the top past Alaska and everything. So this is just to bring everybody together and welcome everybody to the space. Thank you.
I'm Harry Elam, the Senior Vice Provost for Education and Vice President of the Arts. And on behalf of Stanford University, it is my pleasure to welcome you to the 2020 Mimi and Peter Haas Distinguished Visitor Lecture. We want to start today's evening with a university land acknowledgement offered by Stanford student Dakota Kicking Bear Brown. Oh, it's right here. I'm looking for you over there where you were before. So.
Playing tricks on everyone. Just a heads up, parts of this will be in English, other parts will be in my indigenous language, Northern Sierra Miwok. Muchuksutosh kuchi ayama, un utosh tangi kamu hawi tutmu, kuchi shugamatosh kochi chiton, Kangu Oyashe Dakota Brown, Laksutut Wilton Mu, Oyase Oyitsepa Umaka Stanford. Hello everyone, it's great to see so many people here. My name is Dakota Brown and I'm a senior here at Stanford University. On behalf of my Ohlone relatives, I have the privilege of delivering this land acknowledgement. We recognize that Stanford sits on the ancestral land of the Muwekma Ohlone tribe. This land was and continues to be of great importance to the Ohlone people. Consistent with our values of community and diversity, we have a responsibility to acknowledge, honor, and make visible the university's relationship to Native peoples. Hoi amu hauima atu tengi kamu. Upela tim tengi kamutosh. Hausalat takni mash kachi uchu u lioya upenge sokati onikuchi. Ama iachi li papa iachi tengi kamutosh. Tengi kamu. Thank you.
Thank you again, Dakota. We are extremely honored to have Gerald Vizenor as this year's Distinguished Visitor at Stanford. Gerald is an award-winning author, professor emeritus of American Studies at the University of California, Berkeley, and a citizen of the White Earth Nation in Minnesota. He has published more than 30 books, novels, critical theory, cultural studies, and poetry collections. His many awards include the American Book Award and the Western Literature Association Distinguished Achievement Award. Beyond his groundbreaking work as a scholar and author, Gerald has distinguished himself across diverse pathways of public service. So here are just 3 highlights from his extraordinary career. As a direct descendant of the publisher of the White Earth Reservation's first independent newspaper, Gerald's investigative journalism included a report about racism and capital punishment that saved the life of Thomas Whitehawk in South Dakota in late 1960s. Gerald served with the U.S. Army in Japan in the aftermath of the Korean War as part of many generations of family members and citizens of the White Earth Nation who have engaged in military service. And this is a source of his latest book that he's been writing about as well. Finally, Gerald served as a delegate to the Constitutional Convention and as a principal writer of the Constitution of the White Earth Nation. So you can see the incredible range of activities and service that he's done. So we are delighted to have Gerald and his wife, Laura Jane Hall, in residence at the Haas Center for Public Service for the winter quarter. And I would like to thank Mimi Haas for her vision and leadership in working with us to establish the Mimi and Peter E. Haas Distinguished Visitor Program that has brought visionary global leaders to the campus for over a decade. I want to thank also the Haas Center National Advisory Board, including Chair Pamay Bassi, who is visiting. Where are you, Pamay? Thank you. We should have clapped for Mimi and for you, so we'll do a double clap. Thank you both. And many thanks to the Native American Cultural Center and many campus departments, centers, organizations for co-sponsoring today's event. A hand for them too. Actually, I want to particularly thank Karen Beeson, Associate Director and Associate Dean, rather, and Director of Stanford's Native American Cultural Center for your leadership. So, thank you. Mr. Vizenor's visit is particularly timely as Stanford marks the 50th anniversaries of the Stanford American Indian Organization in the fall of 2020 and the Stanford Powwow in the spring of 2021. Today's discussion focuses on Native American survivance. Gerald Vizenor has explained it this way. Native American survivance is an active sense of historical presence, a renunciation of political dominance, themes of tragedy, and cultural victimry. Native survivance is the literature of engagement. Describing the connection between his work and public service, Gerald Vizenor writes, "My sense of public service is a common ambition to create a communal narrative that celebrates change over fate and denies the separation of dominant political authority." So as you can see, tonight's presentation will be extremely timely. Please join me in welcoming our 2020 Mimi and Peter E. Haas Distinguished Visitor, Gerald Vizenor.
Mimi, Harry, Tom, Karen, the singers, Miigwech. Thank you. He took the screen down, but we'll just project one image on the wall here. It's a composite group of figures. Down on the lower part here is my grandmother, Alice Beaulieu, and her brother, my great uncle, John Clement, in uniform of the First World War. Dashing he is. A little farther up, Walter Benjamin, a nice photograph just before he died of suicide. Ted Matteau, a close friend and native philosopher in Minnesota. And Clyde Kluckholm down here in the corner, anthropologist, and others. Thank you for projecting that. Actually, that started spontaneously, not here, but that practice, spontaneously when I followed at the New School, a conference on animals and literature. I followed a brilliant speaker with perfectly masked slides of animals and humans and art. And he had a magnificent voice with a Dutch accent, a Columbia professor, thin, blonde hair, tailored suit, and I was not this well dressed. I realized I was doomed. So I went out on stage not knowing what to do. I knew no one would hear me after that brilliant presentation of slides, so I said, first slide. And that got some humor, but when I said, here you can see me as a child, clearly I'm a dog, that broke it. And then I could actually talk about how Native Americans wrote about animals in literature. The native heirs of the fur trade convene in my stories, essays and historical novels, with a sense of presence, ethos, irony, and literary resistance to gossip theories of discovery, cultural separatism, and more than a century of deceptive federal policies. My stories would not be possible without the sway of native irony and the communal wisdom revealed in the experiences and stories of previous native storyers and literary artists. John Clement Beaulieu, my great uncle, served in the First World War in France and returned from combat with love stories and scarcely mentioned the misery of trenches, fear of death, or the enemy. Later, his stories of romance came to mind as native irony, a sense of survivance over victimry. Arthur Elm, a native from Oneida, Wisconsin, served in a machine gun company in the American Expeditionary Forces in France. He was wounded and recovered with blood transfusions. After this, I didn't know who I was, he told the photographer Joseph Dixon. I was a mixture of Indian, Irish, and Swede. Elm related ironic stories in spite of his combat wounds in the First World War. This was no surprise to me or any other native because natives seldom created stories or dream songs about starvation, epidemics, massacres, or the cruelty of slavery. Creation stories are in natural motion, and trickster stories outplayed dreadful memories, torment, and victimry. John Clement, my great uncle, teased everyone with what seemed to be common sense stories. He once told me that when he tried to walk up an icy hill and slipped 2 steps back with every step forward, he turned around and walked backwards to get over the hill. I was young enough to believe him at the time. Native storyers that reveal natural motion and tease customary experiences are more memorable than the relentless scenes of misery. Native trickster stories were reveals of totemic animals and birds, creative encounters with surly shamans, and the reversal of gravity on an icy hill. Celebrated native storyers favored chance and the wisdom of communal experience that revealed survivance, not fate, tragedy, or vengeance. Survivance is an elusive concept, more than the instinct of survival, and native survivance stories create a sense of presence that counters historical absence, dominance, and the modern literary cues of victimry. The word survivance was used in the 18th century fur trade, and for more than 30 years, it's become a decisive catchword in my native stories and publications. Survivance is forever deferred, however, to successive native storyers of communal experiences. Charles Ovid, for example, more than 50 years ago, inadvertently counseled federal judge Miles Lord. Great name, isn't it? Miles Lord, a federal justice. It's not even believable as fiction. Miles Lord about native stories and survivance. Miles Lord was a compassionate defender of native rights. I don't want to leave any other impression. Miles Lord was Ovid was a native elder and a sworn witness in a dispute between the federal government over the sovereignty of wild rice harvests on the Rice Lake National Wildlife Refuge in Minnesota. Ovid testified in the language of the Anishinaabe that he was present as a boy when federal agents granted Old John Squirrel the right to harvest manoomin, or wild rice. Federal lawyers objected to the story as hearsay. Ovid told several creative versions of the same story, a different perspective, and this reveals the fourth person of native stories, not just three, but the fourth person. And Justice Lord insisted that the witness testify only about his experiences, not about the stories of others. John Squirrel is dead, declared Justice Lord. You can't say what a dead man said. Ovid stood up, pointed at the legal books on the bench, and shouted in English, I was there, that the books contained the words of dead white men. And then he said, why should I believe what a white man says when you don't believe old John Squirrel? The published case law stories were considered precedent, of course, but the wisdom of oral stories in the fourth person was ruled as hearsay. Justice Lord paused, pushed back in his chair, and said, you've got me there. Generous man. Storytelling is not only an art, it is even more than an honor, wrote Walter Benjamin in the Storyteller Essays. A story leads to a kind of wisdom, just as, conversely, wisdom often proves to be a story. A storyteller, therefore, always knows how to give counsel. And by counsel, Benjamin means advice, guidance, and wisdom. He continues, the storyteller finds his material in experience. He owns what he has learned secondhand. And the stories he tells, in turn, become experiences for his audience. Native teases were common experiences, and any native raised in a native family would attest to that. And many natives created ironic stories and imagistic dream songs that teased customary associations. Trickster creation stories honored totemic relations as sources of ethos and wisdom, and countless versions were created at native gatherings. The stories were erotic and lusty, but never gossip theory. That's an introduction to Clyde Kluckhohn. Clyde Kluckhohn, the social anthropologist, published Navajo Witchcraft, an obscure and crafty cluster of folklore gossip theories about strange beasts, sinister spirits, and sorcery more than 70 years ago. But the native stories about his peculiar research manner may have actually reversed the content of the book as irony. Kluckhohn was teased in stories as the man who pissed too much on the Navajo Nation. I was expecting a little more there. Thank you. Kluckhohn was teased as the man who, on the reservation. The eclectic anthropologist traveled around the reservation and asked natives about witchcraft. He probably reasoned that native hitchhikers would reveal more about the chancy phenomenon of witchery in a comfortable automobile, and especially at night in bad weather. The stories about a weak bladder were related to his many piddle stops. The anthropologist actually ducked behind a bush about every 30 minutes, only to write down what he had just heard about witchery. And I can confirm this because as a journalist, I could handle an interview for about 30 minutes and then up to an hour later, almost transcribe it fully. One scholarly review of Navajo witchcraft pointed out that Kluckhohn had described his methods, but he did not provide specific references to the informants. Most of the informants were probably hitchhikers because most natives would not likely mention sinister skinwalkers or the ghastly practices of witchery. The monograph on witchery and witchcraft betrayed natives, and the stagey stories of hitchhikers were illusions that became gossip theory. Jonathan Lear observed in A Case for Irony that irony is a disruption of the familiar, and this confusion of the customary is a more relevant theory to discuss native trickster stories. Lear writes, "The experience of irony thus seems to be a peculiar species of uncanniness, in the sense that something that has been familiar returns to me as strange and unfamiliar." The early translators and interpreters of native stories commonly resolved the disruption of cultural familiarity with the hearsay of marginal listeners, and as a result, denied the wisdom of experience. Native storyers created a sense of presence with the stay of eager listeners, and translations were hardly trustworthy conversions of cultural irony or the wisdom of communal experiences. If storytelling is dying out, observed Peter Brooks in a recent review of the Storyteller essays, so is the art of listening. The creation of a community of listeners around the storyteller. And beyond that, the very communicability of experience is threatened with loss. Not here, of course. Ted Matteau, you saw his picture, the native philosopher, invited me to trade stories at Hello Dolly's, a notorious native liquor bar in Minneapolis. The only other patrons that early morning afternoon were 3 young natives boasting about their scars from a recent Sundance ceremony. The boasts were truly contemptible. Ted calmly walked over to the 3 boasters, smiled in silence, and slowly unbuttoned his shirt, I won't demonstrate that fully, and revealed scars on his chest. "Do you see these scars?" said Ted. The 3 natives leaned closer and pointed at the prominent scars. Ted shouted, "Chickenpox, 1940. He turned away, and we continued our stories of situational irony. A University of Minnesota history professor kindly invited me as a new faculty member in the American Indian Studies Department to dinner at his home. First, though, he escorted me to a side room and handed over a pair of stained leather moccasins and expected me to provide some footsie native provenance. Thank you. I love that, footsie native provenance. I'm sure it's happened often in this room, hasn't it? Yeah. The warrior walked silently in the forest was my first ironic tease. But the historian seemed to be more interested in ethnographic gossip theory. After a close examination of the moccasins, a sniff here and there, my second response was even more ironic. Norwegian man, stinky feet, and he walked with a twisted foot. We became good friends, that historian and me. Walter Benjamin declared, "Every morning, news reaches us from the globe, and today, the impeachment hearings were delivered. And yet, we lack remarkable stories. Why is this the case? It is because no incidents reach us any longer, not already permeated with explanations," wrote Benjamin. In other words, he writes, almost nothing occurs to the story's benefit anymore, but instead it all serves information. And information is valuable only for the moment in which it is new. It lives only in the moment. It must be completely subject to it and explain itself immediately without losing any time. A story is different, he said. It does not use itself up. It preserves its inherent power, which it can then deploy even after a long period of time. Native stories are clearly distinct from information, but the declaration that stories are reduced to explanations and particulars once troubled me greatly, because my stories and critical studies as a young scholar were not related only to the details of the moment. The distinction troubled me even more as a journalist for the Minneapolis Tribune. Frank Premack, the city editor of the Tribune at the time, climbed onto his desk in the huge newsroom at least once a week and shouted out with an incredible voice, "The second coming of Christ is worth no more than a page and a half in this newspaper. So let that be your guide in writing news today." Intimidating at first for someone like me, but people who had heard it a couple of dozen times or more weren't paying much attention. Premack based his ironic and newsy wisdom on the communal experiences of wordy journalists. My first day at the Minneapolis Tribune was Monday, June 3rd, 1968. And 4 days later, Robert Kennedy died of gunshot wounds in Los Angeles. Premack ignored the second coming page limitations and ordered me to write a feature news story that would counter the popular notions of a violent nation. An ironic assignment, it seemed to me at the time, because of the many assassinations: John F. Kennedy, Martin Luther King, Malcolm X, and Robert Kennedy. I'm breathing into this microphone. Is that all right? It sort of like emphasizes certain things, like an exclamation. Premack directed me to counter the notions of violence and personal security. The late 1800s was the most violent period in the nation. And Minneapolis in the 1930s, which surprised me, was one of the most violent cities in the country. Quote, "Violence View Challenged" was the headline of my first story published in the Minneapolis Tribune on Sunday, June 9th, 1968, 6 days into my career as a journalist. Here is a bit of the story. Acts of assassination in the United States cannot support the emotional contention that American society is inherently violent, a University of Minnesota anthropologist declared last week. But while the assassination of a public figure may not prove that ours is a violent society, Professor Luther Gerlach argued, the potential for violence, nevertheless, is built into the traditional structures of our society. Regrettably, my first assignment at the Minneapolis Tribune was not about the massacres of thousands of natives. Premack assigned me 5 months later to report on the funeral services for Dane White, a native schoolboy who had been held for more than 40 days in a county jail for the crime of truancy, which is not a crime in any state. My 1.5-page story ran on the front page of the Minneapolis Tribune on Thursday, November 24th, 1968. Sisseton, South Dakota. Catholic funeral services for Dane White were held here Wednesday in English and the Dakota language at St. Catherine's Indian Mission. Following the service, attended by 75 people, all but 6 of whom were Dakota Indians, Dane was buried in St. Peter's Catholic Cemetery, and more to the end of that 1.5 pages. Frank Premack was right about the 1.5 pages and the second coming, not because he was ironic about the return of Jesus, but because you could run a whole story on a 1.5 pages on the front page with no jump. When people read and have to jump to another page, they stop reading usually. I wrote 3 longer stories about the family: divorce, the county sheriff and his wife, and the juvenile court judge who had denied a native adolescent in jail for truancy and without legal counsel. Cyrus White, his father, visited his son only once in the county jail. Dane White and his older brother and 3 younger sisters lived with their father after a divorce. Dane ran away several times to live with his maternal grandmother in an unpainted house in Long Hollow, near Sisseton, South Dakota, across the river from the Wilkin County Jail in Breckenridge, Minnesota. I visited his grandmother, Marion Starr, and felt at ease, actually secure, in the converted dining room with a badly worn linoleum floor and the smell of fuel oil from a space heater. The scene simply reminded me of my grandmother, Alice Beaulieu Vizenor, and my great-uncle John Clement Beaulieu of the White Earth Reservation and in Minneapolis. Marion smiled and pushed aside the laundry hanging on the line over the space heater. We sat across from each other on wooden chairs for more than an hour and never mentioned the weather or the death of her grandson. She said, Dane was a happy-go-lucky kid, always laughing, and joked around with the other boys. Alice Beaulieu, my paternal grandmother, was in her 60s when she married a blind man who was much younger. They lived in a small Murphy bed apartment near downtown Minneapolis. Alice and Earl walked more than a mile once a week to a warehouse that sold fire-damaged goods and canned vegetables with no labels. They were poor, but not desolate, and their good humor taught me the humanistic art of native survivance. Alice prepared dinner with a sense of mystery, of course, as she selected the vegetables from a can with no label. Camembert, caviar, truffles, never. But rather a surprise can of pale peas, creamed corn, or mushy green beans. Alice and Earl boarded a city bus once a week to the end of the line in the suburbs. They sold small brooms and brushes door to door, the practice at the time of some blind people. But the stories they told were about lonely women who invited them to stay for lunch. Alice was a natural healer with a sway of humor, teases, and stories on the reservation. And in the city suburbs, she was the same empathetic storyer, a wholehearted social worker. And her stories are the testimony of survivance. My stories in literary resistance in the past 50 years were inspired by the principles of The Progress, the first independent newspaper published by my relatives in the late 1800s on the White Earth Reservation. My historical novels and literature engagée were inspired by Romain Rolland, the pacifist, novelist, historian, and philosopher who died at the end of the Second World War in France. His compassion and sense of literary resistance were not related to the later propositions of exotic existentialism promoted by Jean-Paul Sartre. Peter Brooks writes, "The novel brings to the solitary individual something of a simulacrum of the sociality of listening to a story, but always with a residue of knowledge that modernity has shattered true community. Yet, every storyer, listener, writer, and solitary reader brings a crowd of other storyers and authors to the page of every book. And together, they create an ironic scene of modernity. The books have voices," wrote Diane Glancy in Designs of the Night Sky. "I hear the books," she wrote, "not with my ears, but in my imagination. Maybe the voices camp in the library with nowhere else to go." Roland wrote about peace, justice, and duties of the spirit at a time of the unbelievable destruction of war, and appealed to writers, artists, and scientists on the front page of the newspaper L'Humanité on March 31st, 1938. "France has the formidable honor of becoming, in the eyes of the world," he wrote, the last bastion of liberty on the continent. A liberty in all its most vital forms, the most essential for all human order, for all progress, political and social liberty, intellectual liberty and religious liberty. Since at this moment the stampede of barbarism threatens to bring disorder to free thought and the ideal of social justice, to mature respect, equality of men and races. Roland was read more widely at the time than André Gide and Paul Verlaine, clearly because he supported the truth and justice of the partisans, and he encouraged the resistance movements against the Vichy regime and the Nazi occupation of Paris. Roland was widely honored for his sense of ethos, idealism, tolerance, and littérature engagée of the human spirit. Thank you. Thank you.
I'll get people to ask
Okay.
questions. Thank you, Gerald. I'm going to open, we have a few minutes for questions, and I'm going to open it up for questions. But I want to say something before we do that. Karen Biesman came to the Haas Center to introduce the Haas staff to Gerald. And when she did that, she said that Gerald was a rock star. And what she said about that was that Gerald's words, Gerald can make rocks sing. You might have been quoting someone else, I can't remember, but a student at Berkeley. And I want to thank you for the words that you just shared, because then I hope that everybody was able to grab onto some of those rocks singing. For me, it's just amazing to hear you thread events through 3 centuries, lamenting the loss of the art of listening, the need to create a community of listeners, that information is valuable only in the moment in which it is new, the idea of gossip theory, sharing Dane White's story with his family, the notion of survivance and modernity has shattered true community, and storytelling creates an opportunity for us to recreate those things. So those were just some thoughts as I sort of heard that, and I hope that you all were able to sort of grasp onto some of those rock singing as well. I will sort of play the role of traffic control here, but I'm sure that folks have questions for Gerald. Does anyone want to start us off?
I scared everybody.
Yeah, it's funny. I didn't think this was going to be a really a timid crowd. We have a couple of microphones in the room.
Come on, show some resistance.
Gina?
I'll defer.
Oh, sorry. Did we have one? Let's start with whoever just said I'll defer. I'm sorry.
How do
There we
you
go.
handle, you shared so many stories that I'm grappling with. How do you deal with institution?
Ironically.
I knew it.
Yeah. Yes. Oh, no, please. I want to hear questions.
Should I speak since I
Yes,
have
go
the
for it.
microphone? I think it's ironic that here we are at Stanford and sort of the ground zero of this digital transformation of the whole world. And the idea of storytelling, which is so lost in the digital world, is being spoken of. And how can storytelling save us?
Reconsider being afraid of the dark. And it's easy to tell a story. What is inhibiting is if anybody will like it. It's also difficult because almost all of us have been trained in multiple ways to construct stories for writing, not for speaking. We don't know how the oral works generally, and you can get immediate attention if you don't start with the traditional subject, but start with motion. Trickster was going along, and he was just creating the earth. The water was rising up to his nose, and he had to defecate. It's hard not to get attention for a story like that. I mean, isn't it perfect that the most important, it's wisdom, the most important things you do in life, you have to make sure you evacuate first. I did before I came down here. Okay. Thank you for that. Yeah.
Anine, Dr. Vizenor, what advice do you have for Anishinaabe who are just starting our journey in and outside the academy?
Oh, boy. Well, it's really hard to be playful when everything is so serious. I think, well, I'm going to, you see how old I am, so it isn't going to work, but I'll try it anyway, okay? I think what's a good idea is to get really comfortable on your own and quickly with some theoretical ideas and try them out. And what I mean is try to imagine them your way and use them your way. And you'll find people listening and reading. I hope it works. I mean, for instance, I did this, actually kind of started inadvertently because I was reading some French theory and it was really difficult. And so I thought, well, I'm going to make this work. And Baudrillard and simulacra, brilliant stuff. It just worked perfectly about the creation and simulation of the word Indian. I mean, I don't need a better theory than talk about Baudrillard and simulacra. You know, I mean, what a great gift from the French. You know, they were in the fur trade, they have a right. Excuse me. And Derrida, here's one that has been so useful to me as a human being. Language isn't the end. It isn't the conclusion. There's no, closure with the last sentence, even though short story writer teachers want to tell you that to do. But Derrida comes up with difference, that the word is deferred to the next meaning. Of course it is. I thought, of course, I don't own this word. I'm using simulation, and I said in my lecture that it's deferred to the next storyers to make use of it. That I found really useful. And you can also get a lot of attention for stuff like that.
We have another question in the back row.
Thank you. Hi. I wonder if you have one story to tell for us today, for this moment in time, maybe for the youth.
Yes.
I'd love to hear it.
I like this one myself. I'm going to do two. My grandmother postponed her wedding to a blind man until I came home on leave from basic training, and I was on my way to Korea, but didn't get there. I got to Japan, luckily, instead. And of course, I'm 18 with a really smart uniform. Boy, was I something. And I walked up on the porch, really feeling good in uniform, and my grandmother rushes out, not even paying attention to the uniform, of course, grabs me firmly and says, "Don't you tell him what I look like." And I didn't get it at first, I didn't know he was blind, see. And I said, okay. It was pretty intense. And then later I said, oh, I would have told you you're the most beautiful woman I've ever known. She was sweet, and when she laughed, her belly jumped. Boy, was she lovely. And a teaser. The second story I think you're going to laugh about too, a little riskier, but I'll try it. I have a hard time believing this, but I was 15 years old when I enlisted and lied my age in the Minnesota National Guard. Looking for adventure, of course, wanted to be a warrior of some kind, and learned how to march and do all that stuff pretty quickly. Then came summer camp where you shoot guns and throw hand grenades. What a paradise for an 18-year-old. Even tank cannons and bazookas. I mean, this was out of this world adventure. I mean, you can read comic books about superheroes. I was one. I mean, you know, this was the most terrific thing, and I thought they didn't know how old I was. Well, and I tell you, I had to go to my records and look up my discharge from the National Guard to be sure I really was 15, and I was. It's hard to believe, especially when I meet 15-year-olds today. So I'm in summer camp, and I'm doing everything right, you know, because I don't want anyone to catch on that I'm underage. And I hear my name announced on the loudspeaker. Report immediately to the first sergeant. So I run up there and do my stuff. And he says to me, really firmly, crossly, I've been examining your records, Vizenor. Where the hell are your masturbation papers? Now, he took a chance, and he was right. I never heard of the word. I actually did hear about matriculation, and I was wondering if he mispronounced it. But I never heard the word. And I don't have to repeat the other words that are used that I knew really well. Okay. So he said, God damn it, Vizenor, how the hell did you get in this man's army? Usual stuff. You know, threatening me. And he said, I don't know what you're going to do. What can I do? I don't know what you can do. You're going to have to go up to see some captain somebody. So he called ahead, got to that assistant to the captain, and this went to 3 stages where I reported for my masturbation papers. Oh. Sir, Private Vizenor, reporting from my masturbation papers. And finally, there was nowhere to send me but the post commander, a general. And of course, they couldn't all call ahead on that one. So I'm on my own now. And I get there and I report to his captain, his assistant, and sir, I'm reporting from my masturbation papers. He said, I said, my masturbation papers, I've been sent, la-da-da. That was my mistake. I've been sent by, I learned a real lesson there. It wasn't about masturbation. It was about don't tell people how you got here. So this captain says, I think the general's going to enjoy talking to you. So I went in and did it. And he said, son, do you know what jacking off means? And I backed up. I thought this guy was strange, see? Talking to me like that, and I backed up and said, yes, sir. And he said, well, you better go back to your barracks and figure it out. I wrote about that, actually, in an autobiography. I couldn't resist it. It's so stupid, but so telling about missing the meaning of a word. I didn't make that mistake when I enlisted as a 18-year-old soldier, though.
Well, thank you for that question, I think. We have a question over here.
Hi. I'm curious whether you're finding that the rise in podcasting has made any difference in the acceptance of storytelling.
Oh, of course. Well, you give it a little more. Talk a little more about it.
At the beginning of your talk, I was sort of surprised by your not having slides. I come from computer science and all that, and slides are sort of the norm. And then I thought, well, actually, as I walked over here, I was listening to podcasts all the way.
Ah.
And so, yes, I am used to listening to words without seeing anything
Yeah.
at the same time. And
very good.
that's a
Yeah.
change that I've found recently in my life. And it struck me that that was a lot like your talk and a lot like
Oh,
the history
thank you.
of storytelling.
Yeah.
And I just wanted you to
did
talk
ask you
about
to
that.
imagine.
You
some
did,
slides.
of course.
I think what it does, it puts you into a visual possibility, you know, it sets you up a little bit for what, and then, oh, I get it, you know. So there's a little bit of suggestion of visual imagery. And that's part of motion and thinking about ideas and images differently than descriptions.
That's time for one more question. Yeah. How about you?
I would like to ask for, like on behalf of some of the Native youth in this crowd today, what's some advice you'd give to us on how we can promote Native survivance and resilience to our non-Native peers in this contemporary world where they're so inundated with so much other information, and we're trying to educate them about our identities and our stories as you've gone over?
This may appear just too obvious, but there's an absence always. And just check out where the absence is, and it's everywhere, and then work to fill the absence with creative ideas and stories. And it's easier to do than anybody might think. You can find just enough information to make a good story about the absence. And it confronts then that whole idea that natives are much more complex because of very complex ideas. And I think I evaded that pretty successfully, didn't I? Yeah. Let me try another one. I think playful language is much better than any kind of serious direct discourse, unless it's an examination of some kind. And it really does concentrate a thought for a moment or a little longer than that. And then you can work an idea and work a reference, and especially, I think, work something that's imagistic and use it as a reference. I often like to talk about dream songs, and because just the description of it is like an opening. Immediately it's interesting, and then you can, or I have worked on it, and one of my favorite kind of openings sometimes is how dream songs are taken so literally, you know, that they're translated, so therefore they're a text. And then I sort of unwind the translation and point out that it was sung or kind of half chanted, and the words don't quite mean what ended up in translation. For one thing, there probably were no pronouns. So you can use language as the primary source of play and then show examples, and then what you're doing is also what you're talking about. That's better. That is better, yeah. Thanks.
There you go. All right, well, let me conclude this evening with a few thank yous and some logistical information for everyone. First of all, I just want to thank Harry for his great introduction, and also want to thank Susie Brubaker-Cole also for coming tonight, Vice Provost for Student Affairs. I want to thank the drummers for the amazing beginning to our evening. Dakota, thank you for the land acknowledgement. As usual with our distinguished visitor, we actually have, Gerald is about a week and a half into his quarter-long visit, so this is really the beginning of a storytelling, playful language kind of quarter for us. And so I want to invite folks, particularly if you're a student living in a dorm and want to bring Gerald to your dorm, or if you're a faculty member in a class and you'd like to have Gerald come to your class, or if you have other things that you'd like to have Gerald do, we are encouraging you to take advantage of the fact that we have this tremendous elder in our presence for this quarter. So there are Haas staff here. Just you can talk to them. I also want to give a shout out to Lawrence. Lawrence, raise your hand. Lawrence is actually the person who's going to be teased a lot this quarter, I think. I'm gathering from even his initial interactions with Gerald. But Lawrence is actually helping Gerald and can be a point of contact for folks who want to get in touch with Gerald.
Address him as Cardinal Lawrence.
Cardinal Lawrence, see? You see what I mean? Poor Lawrence. All right. Finally, just thank you once again to everyone, and thank you to Gerald Vizenor for his lecture.
Thank you, Tom. I think that masturbation.